the methods used in biblical exegesis follow the developments within literary criticism, although at a certain distance. Every text analysis, both in biblical exegesis and literary criticism, has to deal with the triplet author, text, reader. This triplet is in itself very obvious, but this is not the case for the chosen focus in this triplet. In this paper, I would like to describe the developments in the exegetical approaches from the viewpoint of the three possible focuses, against the background of the developments in literary criticism. After abstracting all sorts of details and various side developments, I distinguish three phases. A first phase is a focus on the author from the 17th century onward. A second phase with a focus on the text from the 60s of the last century onward. And a third phase with a focus on the reader existing since the last couple of decades. Because biblical exegesis is not just about theoretical approaches towards a text, but also about the concrete analysis of biblical text, I will use Amos 7, the verses 10 to 17, as an example of the three phases. I will conclude my paper by presenting my communication-oriented exegetical method, in which I integrate all three focuses of the three phases I distinguish. So I'll start with the first phase. When biblical exegesis as a modern critical discipline arose, the focus was on the author, more specifically on the author as a historical person. This focus is not surprising, for the origin of biblical exegesis, especially Old Testament exegesis, as a critical scholarly discipline, lies with the question whether Moses could be or not be the author of the 5 first books of the Bible. Based on textual observations regarding wording and figure of speech, the answer was negative. Answering the question of how we should then view the origin of the Pentateuch, various source theories arose, such as a documentary hypothesis concerning the sources E.G., D, and P. These sources were considered to be literary products written by historical persons, although anonymous, endowed with great literary creativity. The rise of the younger source theories of gender criticism and form criticism was shocking. After all, they describe similarities in genres and motives with literary products from elsewhere in the ancient Near East. Biblical text does appear to be part of a development of reusing of common genres, motives, and imagery, in which the idea of one single author writing in a unique way is replaced with the idea of various anonymous persons belonging to an already existing literary tradition. Various presuppositions underlie these historical critical approaches. The most important one is the idea that there is a one-to-one relationship between text and the extra-textual reality, due to which the textual world and the extra-textual world in fact coincide. An appreciation, maybe over-appreciation for empiricism also underlies the historical critical approaches. Measuring is knowing. This gave the rise to a worldview in which only that which can be measured empirically is true. This also strengthened the idea of a one-to-one relationship between the textual and extra-textual world, certainly in the popular understanding of the Bible. What does this first phase mean for the exegesis of the narrative text of Amos, chapter 7, verse 10 to 17? The narration is usually read as a historical account, but this comes into conflict with the empirical historical reality. From historical research, we know that King Jeroboam was certainly not killed by the sword, and that he died a natural death after a long and prosperous reign. In its turn, this conflict causes much speculation about the theological implications of so-called unveiled announcements which occur in prophetic texts. After all, in the first phase, a prophet is considered to speak the truth only when his utterances are historically verifiable. I will skip some paragraphs on dating the historical Amos and some layers in the text. So I will restart with the second phase, the focus on the text. In the second phase, the focus moves to the text. Focusing on the text arose in literary criticism initially in response to Romanticism, in which the feelings of the author were dominant. The major name for this movement is structuralism. The focus is not on the emotions of the maker or makers of the text, but on the form of the text, whereas form and meaning are considered to be interrelated. Structuralism covers many scholarly disciplines, from philosophy to cultural anthropology. Regarding linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure is the point of origin when he escaped the one-to-one idea of the first phase by formulating a couple of important distinctions. For exegesis, the two most important ones are the distinctions between synchrony, which studies a literary phenomenon at one single point in time, and diachrony, which studies the same phenomenon in its changing literary forms through time, and between signifier, the outer form of a sign, and signified, that to which a sign refers. In structuralistic literary criticism, also called formalism, two main movements initially develop: Russian formalism and a new criticism of the Anglo-American world. Certainly within exegesis, Russian formalism is well known because of its literary research into fairy tales by Vladimir Prof. The new criticism is first of all characterized by the rejection of the author's intention as well as the author's authority, and parallel to this, of a reader's psychology. William Wimsatt calls the idea that the intention of the real author would be present in the text, rather in a direct or in an encrypted way, intentional fallacy. The structuralistic movements develop a new approach of analysis, the closer reading. In closer reading, attention is given to each word, to each clause, and to the order of the clauses. Syntax, therefore, has become an important part of literary analysis, although initially syntax was mostly limited to word syntax. Narratology stemmed from Russian formalism. It can be divided into two movements: modal narratology and semiotic narratology. The main literary scholar for modal narratology is Gérard Genette. He introduces the important terms order, duration, and frequency. Genette also introduces the term voice. Regarding the semiotic narratological analysis, Gréma is the main scholar. He introduces the semantic square and attentional narrative model, probably all well known to all of you. Post-structuralism is a continuation of structuralism, especially in the French-speaking world. In post-structuralism, the idea of the polyinterpretability of a text has become more and more important in such a way that the tendency has arisen that any interpretation is accepted as being a possible and consistent understanding of the text. Against the background of the polyinterpretability of texts, as found especially in semiotics and post-structuralism, intertextuality has arisen. Texts have relation with other texts. In intertextuality, these relationships are primarily studied descriptively. The question is not which of the two texts related to one another is the oldest, but what does the relationship between them look like? Since the reception of this second phase in biblical exegesis from the 60s of last century onward, close reading, and to a slightly lesser extent narratology, have proved especially fruitful. The many handbooks on literary and narratological techniques testify to this as well. Although semiotics can be valuable, the disadvantage of a semiotic analysis is that the roles of the narrative characters have been determined already in advance in terms as hero and helper. Deconstruction, however, appears hardly to have been received in biblical exegesis due to its lack of being text-oriented. Moreover, the text is in danger of getting lost, just like happens in a multifaceted source theory, for the text is nothing more than just a loose collection of words and phrases, whether conflicting historical sources, as in the first phase, or conflicting textual meanings, as in the second phase. Nevertheless, the developments within structuralism have made clear that text could have more than just one single meaning, and that, as a result, the idea of one text, one interpretation, as a kind of a one-to-one relationship has been abandoned. This does not imply that the text can mean anything. Biblical exegesis should also be normative. In other words, biblical exegesis should be able to say that an interpretation of a text is incorrect. I will skip the reception of the intertextuality by the canonical approach and the new developments in the study of the Hebrew grammar, and go on with the influence of this second phase on the exegesis of the book of Amos, because in this second exegetical phase, a special interest arose in the structure of the book. Regarding the book as a whole, the idea of a diptych arose. The chapters 1 to 6 form the first main unit, and the chapters 7 to 9 the second main unit. This idea is based on the occurrence of the expression divreamos and the verb chaza in the heading of the book. The divreamos, the words of Amos, are considered to cover the chapters 1 to 6, while the aspect of the activity of chaza, the activity of seeing, is dealt with in the chapters 7 to 9. However, it is very questionable whether this conclusion is correct. An Amos exegesis that makes a hard distinction between words and visions ignores the fact that texts such as chapter 7, 1 to 3, one of the so-called visions, are words of the prophet as well, because it is the prophetic character that tells what he saw. The chapters 7 to 9 are not less divreamos than the chapters 1 to 6. The weak point of such observations concerning words and the visions of Amos is that the point of departure is semantics. That is why syntax should always precede semantics. This implies that the first observation must be that Amos, chapter 1, verse 1, syntactically is the heading, and after the heading, the text begins with the Vayikol form Vayomar. Then he said in verse 2a. This Vayikol form opens a narrative chain which the Vayikol forms in Amos 7 continue. These syntactical observations exclude the possibility of a diptych consisting of the chapters 1 to 6 and 7 to 9. Because of the time, I will skip now the paragraph on intertextuality. In this phase, a lot of intertextuality arises. It's an intertextuality within Old Testament, between Old and New Testament, but also with rabbinic sources or patristic sources. And I would like to continue with the third focus, the focus on the reader. His new phase is not so much a phase following up the preceding phases, but develops within literary criticism from the 20s of the previous century onwards under the broader name reader-response criticism. Its reception in biblical exegesis has been underway as from the past few decades. There are two main movements in reader-response criticism: a psychological reader-response criticism and a text-immanent reader-response criticism. Just as the case in the two focuses of the preceding phases, however, the psychological reader-response criticism is characterized by a one-to-one relationship, but this time regarding the real reader. In the second movement, in reader-response criticism, the focus is on the text internal reader. A complex arsenal of terms, hard to survey, has developed to indicate this text internal reader. There is a list on the handout, on the paper you have, but I will skip the list. Due to the various indications of readers who could be situated either inside or outside the text, or even inside as well as outside of a text, the idea has developed in this deep movement that the supremacy of assignment of meaning is situated with the reader. Wolfgang Iser makes the reader to be only filling in gaps, and in such a way that what a reader reads in the gaps is already implicitly present in the text. This is the reason why Iser devised his implied reader. But Stanley Fish, for example, makes the reader to be not only filling in gaps, but all meaning. Biblical exegesis has especially incorporated the textual reader-response criticism. In biblical exegesis, the confusing amount of terms in reader-response criticism has caused a problem as to what kind of reader is actually meant. If an exegete is not aware of which reader's position in the communication process inside and or outside of the text is indicated, the reader might become a repository of all that can be said about whichever reader. In my view, in the reception of the reader-response criticism, two dangers are present. First, the focus on the text internal reader often causes a fading away of the extra-textual communication. And secondly, the reader pole of the communication is paired with all the extras attached to the author pole in the first phase. For the Amos exegesis, this third phase has especially created interest in gaps, particularly regarding the narration in chapter 7. Verse 10 tells that Amaziah sends a message to King Jeroboam that Amos has been conspiring against the king. After this, the text tells a narration about what Amaziah says to Amos and Amos to Amaziah. In between, there is a gap which leads to two reading options. The text can be read so that Amaziah acts before having received an answer from the king. Whereas in all direct speeches, the so-called Boten formal is used, the Boten formal is missing in the direct speech of Amaziah to Amos to indicate that he is speaking on behalf of King Jeroboam. This implies that Amaziah sends away Amos on its own initiative. A second reading option, however, is also possible. Amaziah's action is read as following King Jeroboam's instructions given to Amaziah. After all, biblical accounts normally do not retell obvious repetitions. Both reading options demand reading activity of the text-immanent reader, distinguished from the real reader. We might not notice this gap at all. I went to my communication-oriented exegesis. In biblical exegesis, the three focuses, as they are present in the three phases, are often considered as competing with each other. In my view, this is neither adequate nor fruitful. I would therefore like to present my exegetical approach of communication-oriented exegesis in short. The communication-oriented exegesis should lead to an integration of all three focuses. Therefore, I believe the following elements are essential. First, exegesis starts with the text. The text is the hard material of exegesis. Firstly, the text is studied syntactically. Secondly, semantically. Syntax is about the grammatical structure of the text. Within this framework, the semantics of the text can be explored. Secondly, texts are communication between sender and receiver. However, we do not need many of the overcomplicated communication schemes with too many authors and readers. In my view, only 4 layers of communication are present regarding text. Outside of the text, we have the communication from the real author to the real reader. Within the text, we find the states on which the characters perform. Characters communicate with each other verbally, by means of direct speeches, as well as non-verbally. Characters, however, do not perform on their own initiative. There is a position in the text which determines when a character is allowed to perform on the scene. In accordance with the text sort, either narration or discursion, this position is called narrator or discursor. The narrator-discursor on the author's pole corresponds with the narrative or discoursee on the reader's pole. In his turn, the narrator-discursor is also not independent, but is determined by the implied author. The implied author corresponds with the implied reader. And there is a nice scheme, maybe here on this screen. Otherwise, it's, oh, there's this. Otherwise, it's on your paper. Thirdly, diachrony has its place after synchrony. As a matter of course, diachrony cannot be realized using a one-to-one relationship between the characters and the extra-textual world. In my view, diachrony takes place via the implied author and the implied reader, with possibility conditions are presupposed regarding the implied author and the implied reader of the text. Therefore, the scheme needs some elaboration, as you can see on your paper. In this paper, I do not have, of course, I do not have the opportunity to apply all these aspects in detail to Amos 7, but maybe I can mention a couple of things. From a syntactical point of view, the narrative acts are indicated by the Wieringen forms. This reveals various aspects of the narration based on which the narration has to be considered as being an open narration. The narration has an open beginning. The narration does not start with the standard Wieringen form Wajehi, but with the Wieringen form Wajeslach, and then he, a Messiah, sent. This implies that the narration starts in medias res. The narration has an open end as well. Neither the ending regarding Amos nor the ending regarding Amaziah is narrated. After the narration, a double ending is suggested in the discursive text, rendering visions about the destruction of the temple and rendering words about the turn the Lord will realize for his people Israel. However, how this double ending is related to the characters in the narration is not made explicit. And the narration has an open plot. The narration only contains speaking acts where there is no plot at all. The realization of the speaking acts is absent in the text. What does Jeroboam do with Amaziah's message? What does Amos do with Amaziah's call to leave? What does Amaziah do with Amos' announcement of exile? From a semantic point, the text is ambiguous as well. Is Beit El in verse 10 a place in the northern kingdom of Israel? Or does Kohen Beit El mean the priest of the house of God, an expression which better suits Jerusalem in the southern kingdom of Judah? The syntactical and semantical characteristic of Amos 7:10-17 make a demand upon the narrative to do reading work. The narrative has to construct both a beginning and a conclusion of the narration. This conclusion, dealing with the open end of the narration, reaches beyond the text. If exile and or return are not in the text but beyond the text, they could pertain to the narrative as well. These characteristics bring me to presuppose possibility condition for the implied author and reader, which assume there are knowledge concerning the northern and southern kingdom, and maybe even concerning the exile. This implies that the end text has to be dated at least after the decline of the northern kingdom caused by Assur. For the southern kingdom looms up behind the northern kingdom, not the other way around. This does not exclude an older prophet narration concerning Amos in the northern kingdom, but such a narration is not traceable. I think that my my communication-oriented exegesis is important for theology in general. The importance of the communication-oriented exegesis for theology lies in the fact that new texts create communicative relationships with other already existing texts. A real reader reading a text gets in touch with the text's internal readers, the narrative, discourse, the implied reader. And in relation to these textual readers' position, the real reader becomes a real author, creating a new text with its own text internal communication positions. This implies that the scheme of the textual communication has to be elaborated in the way you can see on the screen. The real reader is not only the final destination of the textual communication, but has a communicative relationship towards the text as well. This phenomenon is usually called contextualization. In this contextualization, new texts arise. This chain of text, in which new texts are in communication with other texts, is already present in the Bible itself, both in the Old and New Testament. But it continues in post-biblical time as well. Theology, Catholic theology, therefore, is the communication-oriented analysis of component of this textual chain. Only in this way, I believe, can Catholic theology participate in the communication evoked by the Scriptures and continue the various tradition of the textual communication poles in thought, action, and celebration? Thank you very much for your kind attention.